podcast, where each week we break down a different randomly selected album from Enemy Magazine's Top 500 Albums of All Time list. This week we're breaking down number 215, which is the album Mezzanine by Massive Attack. Our guest today is a journalist, writer, and podcaster informing the world on African affairs, art, activism, and of course music, contributing to BBC World Service, CBC, DW, and currently with RFI in France. She's the author of one of our chief resources for diving into Massive Attack this week, and her book, Massive Attack Out of the Comfort Zone, which takes a look not only at the music group themselves, but the city of Bristol and how it informed the movement that led to the creation of the group. We are now thrilled to welcome the author of this incredible book, Melissa Shemam, to the podcast. Thank you for joining me today, Melissa.
Hello, nice being with you. Thank you for calling all the way from Seattle.
Yeah, thank you for calling from Paris, I believe, correct?
Yes, I travel a lot, but I'm in Paris tonight.
Oh, wonderful. Well, love the technology. So, in your book, you frame Bristol almost a character in the story. What is it about Bristol's history, socially, politically, culturally, that made it such a fertile ground for something like Massive Attack to emerge?
Yes, I thought for me that this was an interesting part of the story, right? When you're a band from New York, obviously there are so many people that came before you. You're not going to pretend you defined your city, right? But
Right.
in that case, Bristol, when I went there with the idea of writing the book, a lot of friends told me, where is that? Are you not going to Brighton? Or shouldn't you go to Liverpool? Because they were already on the
Right.
cultural map of British music, right? So it became quite obvious that the music and the city were interlinked and they enrich each other. And there were a lot to tell about how it formed the bands. They didn't always agree with that though, especially Portishead. So if you know, Portishead is a little city outside of
Mhm.
Bristol. So it has its name of its own. So not everybody knows that the band is named after another city. So sometimes the band doesn't like to be reminded that they have a link to Bristol, and they all want to tell that they have an exceptional trajectory. But in that case, I think for me, it was quite obvious that Bristol made that cultural moment quite special because of its long history. So Bristol is on the coast, on the west coast of England, southwest England, looking towards the United States and Canada. And actually, it started to become really wealthy when the trade with the colonies in North America really took, a flight, really went away. And Bristol had a very early role. The first ship that left Bristol for North America left in 1497. So that's
Oh,
only
wow.
years after the famous trip from Columbus himself. So there was a very strong route from England to America via Bristol. Actually, from London, that route was also later on reinforced by all the industrialist
Mhm.
era in England and the train rides. So for a long period, it made England very rich. And there was even a time where Bristol was richer than Liverpool or London, momentarily, I think half a century.
Hmm.
But also, what made this sound particularly is what happened after that. So, of course, the main strong elements of the trade between the Americas and Europe was the transatlantic slave trade and
Mhm.
sugar and plantation. So, I think Bristol had a stronger legacy than other cities in England with that culture, specifically the Caribbean culture, to jump back 3 centuries. So a lot of people from the Caribbean with African roots came to England via Bristol during the, let's say, the 1800s, the post anti-slavery era, and then of course with the Great Wars, especially World War One, and then after that with the Windrush generation, and that takes us to our time, right? The founders of Massive Attack and people like Tricky and other musicians and DJs who played with them when they were young were immigrants or children of immigrants from the Windrush generation. So what we call the Windrush generation is named after another ship that took labor workers from mostly Jamaica and other colonies to London to contribute to the reconstruction after World War II. So that was the culture they were all living in. They were listening to this music. They were going to balls and parties where the parents and grandparents played lovers rock and reggae. And that was totally unknown in the 50s or 60s. It was just a personal experience. But I
Right.
think the first albums and the bands that predates Massive Attack in Bristol made that particularly strong as a root, because of course you know that this music is characterized by a mix of different genres,
Hmm.
but those genres were kind of the heart and the soul of how it all started. And then of course came hip hop and a huge influence from New York, which is still linked to the history of Bristol, right? Because these generations kind of had cousins in New England or in New York or New Jersey, so they were very into the first records that came from the East Coast that were rap and black music. That's the shortcut to why Bristol, I think for me, just made their music very, very localized.
Yeah, it's a very unique melting pot, the picture you paint in the book, and it really does kind of explain how they got to where they were, and it's an unusual mix. But I guess Bristol, you mentioned it isn't usually thought of like Liverpool or Brighton or Manchester. Why do you think Bristol was overlooked for so long? I mean, despite how deep and kind of different the scene was.
Well, first these guys, they came quite late. I mean, Blue Lines was released in 1991, and Manchester already had, I think, two generations of musicians. Let's not even mention Liverpool. Actually, I have friends from Liverpool who have lived there for a long time and actually tired of how long the history of the music is, and have talking about the Beatles all the time makes them
Right?
sick. So for Bristol, it came much later, and it came at a time that was very different, right? The 60s, it's like the golden years for England, right? Post recovery, after the war, finally the economy's back on track, and from photography to cinema to music, the country is living quite a nice time that is very, I guess, romanticized now because very much homogenic. I mean, that culture was pretty much middle class to upper class,
Mhm.
brilliant theater, but most of them were white English people. When we fast forward 30 years later, in places like Bristol, we have a mix of working class sons of immigrants, and obviously, it's a completely different mix. So you have other parts of England where that was really existing and booming as well, but it was mixed with another reality. So that kind of blew into people's face when Blue Lines came out, that this strong influence from reggae with the voice of Horace Andy, who's literally himself from
Mhm.
Kingston, who worked with Bob Marley in Studio One, and all this kind of soulful elements and these wonderful voices like Sharon Nelson. Before that, they were Black British musicians, but they were not really as successful as they could have been before that era. I think because radios were gatekeepers and commercial
Sure.
success had to come quite fast. And if you were the outsider, sometimes you were happy to stay. But there were examples, for instance, in Bristol itself, there were very brilliant reggae bands, and they didn't get the success that they deserve. And one of them ended up touring with UB40, which is made mostly of white English boys doing
Mhm.
post reggae. So that was a key moment. That album was very successful compared to others. And before that, Bristol was only known for being the hometown of the wonderful Cary Grant, and
Oh, okay.
for having the Bristol Old Vic Theatre, where a lot of great actors had been trained, not Cary Grant. And most people believe Cary Grant's American, right? The story, it's not a
Right.
story he wanted to push forward. There's a statue of him in the center of Bristol. People are very proud of him. And Bristol has had a strong part on the shadow side of his personal story. He had to come back because of the tragic story of his mother. But even that became known really late in his life.
Mhm.
So what the city was known for in the 60s and 70s was very banal among English cities. A bit of a jazz scene, the theatre, but of course, an actor that was famous would leave Bristol happily. What happened with Massive Attack is that they were proud to say, we have a Bristol accent, we're from here, we're from a very special part of Bristol. So that's important to say that these guys, they don't represent the whole of the city. The city has a very middle class, very British side, but they represent another side. And that's what the city is known for today, which is a bit of irony, an irony, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of flipped about a bit.
Yes.
So you talked about like the Caribbean influences and the families that came there. With that and like the sound system culture, how did that help like shape the musical instincts of the members of Massive Attack?
Well, it helped that very, very directly because actually, you know what, most of the DJs in the band had family who were not only fans of music, but who had a direct role in how this music came to become alive in the city. Let me give you an example. Tricky, for instance, he grew up in South Bristol, and he had a very fractured family. He didn't grow up with his dad, but with his white family, he's mixed race. But he
Mhm.
discovered later that his father was one of the pioneer DJs in town, so that he kind of inherited his talent for picking sound. And Grant Marshall, who's known as Daddy G in Massive Attack, has the same story. His parents were crazy about music. They were always having parties at home, and they were spending their Friday nights in local clubs that would play Black American music and reggae particularly. So they grew up with it, and Daddy G became DJ at home almost. His first job, I think, was in a record shop. And so he and friends would pick up those records from Black music from all over the world, because obviously Black music is very, very post-Black Atlantic, right? It's very much
Yeah.
linked to the roots in Africa, to what was happening in the United States. And everyone would pick their side into this, you know, the core Jamaican reggae fans to the more soulful, complicated towards R&B sounds, and people who were pure rap, depending on sometimes their age gap. You know, the Mushroom, the third member of Massive Attack, he was only 15 when he started coming to the clubs, and he didn't start by coming to enjoy the music. At 15, he came to see the DJ and say, "You should play that," which is really,
Right.
really forward.
So your book does draw like a line between like the reggae sound system as well as hip hop and like punk's DIY attitude. How did
Yes.
those scenes come together in Bristol? It's definitely a unique mix, I would say.
Yeah, and it is obviously the most interesting part. So I came to listen to this music because I was a big soul baby and I loved rap. And so I was in love with that part that came from England, because England is just here, right? Compared to the US. So that really spoke to me. But that's very, very true that actually the music has multiple influences. And some of the members of the proto bands that were active in Bristol in the 80s, one was the White Bunch that had about 6 to 7 members, and three of them became Massive Attack in 1988.
Mm.
They had a very, very wide tastes and range of records they were obsessed with. And they also grew up with friends who were a bit older than them, who were very much into punk music. So punk music is interesting in the UK, a bit like in the US, but I think it was bigger for the UK, for the size of the UK, you see. It's really
Yeah.
that moment where after the 60s that we describe as like paradise, like, you know, cultural boom, the economy shifted and it was kind of struggle again. So punk was born out of, we don't have much. What kind of sound can we do with just one guitar and lyrics that are much more, you know, critical or negative or
Yeah.
calling for change?
Pragmatic. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of these singers were not there to have pretty voices or to do things perfectly. They wanted to express rage on stage, and that gave us people like The Clash. And so The Clash came to Bristol quite a few times. Actually, one of the musicians from the scene that's quite known worked with them a little bit at some point. He toured with them. So Bristol was also probably not known musically for a long time because it was too close to London. So anyone with talent would just vanish in the capital. And so they wouldn't help contribute into creating something different. Unlike Manchester, that has a stronger history, has its own industrial era, its own moments. So that came with these guys in clubs in the 80s. But also, Bristol had a few very interesting punk bands. They're not worldwide famous, but they had a very interesting career, like the pop group which was named
Mhm.
ironically again.
Yeah.
They called themselves a pop group, but they wanted to do post-punk. So I don't need to explain to you what British people call post-punk, because punk died quite early on with the
Yeah, from what I heard, exactly. As soon as that Sex Pistols album came out, that's where I hear everybody say the scene died.
exactly, that's such a catchphrase at the time. Oh, the scene is dead. And also because of this DIY, very anti-system time, I think no one wanted to reuse the term, the idea of punk, to make a genre, or to create perpetuity. There was a sense of a rapture, and then it was supposed to be gone. But of course, the sound persisted, and that's what we call in England post-punk. And post-punk has had I don't know how many waves now, probably 6 or 7, and that was really,
Still
really,
hasn't stopped. Yeah.
yeah, there's still a new wave somewhere. So these bands were very defining for young Bristolians, because they didn't sing very well, but they had a guitar. They made a lot of noise, and they traveled to London. They met with the Clash, as I said, and other
Hmm.
bands, and they brought them to Bristol. And that was a bit of a moment of fresh air in the mid 70s and late 70s, to have something represent this generation that was on the dole, as they say in England. So they were unemployed with just little money from the state. Thatcher came to power in 79. So the city, when I looked at the photo and I retell the stories of people I interviewed, was like gloomy and dark, and all the docks were abandoned, and there were only a few
Right.
places where you could have fun, and you mostly had to create them. So they took an old bar and made it into a club for fun and music. And if you think of the fare they had to pay at the entry compared to now, it's ridiculous.
Right.
Everything was free. Even alcohol was almost free. So it was a way to exist, to express yourself culturally. And then, of course, for the generation that we're talking about, that came a few years later, they were 14, 15 when they saw the pop group in a small stage in Bristol. And the lead singer, Mark Stewart, he was this very tall, very strong, super big, with this crazy voice guy, but very, very nice and very charming, very funny. So he was everyone's idol, and that stayed with them. They all, I think, felt they could sing like a punk star, even before they felt that they could do rap. I think that's
Right.
what you can say for many of them, because it was not about trying to succeed commercially, or to have a career. It was just about to expressing yourself somehow.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about punk at the end of the day is, I think after a week of playing, you pretty much can be a punk musician, turn in
Yeah.
your
So
instrument
even
and
though I never
yeah,
tried, you
get
might.
get a microphone. Yeah, exactly. Just say something and express yourself.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering, could you
sorry.
talk about how like record shops, clubs, and even some of the informal spaces like Revolver Records or the Dugout, how do those function as basically incubators for the scene?
Yeah, and you might know there is actually a book about the shop, Revolver, I think, by a British writer. So I wasn't there. Obviously, I'm much younger than the artists involved, but from what they were told, yes, it was very central, because at the time collecting vinyl was the typical hobby of these young people. And again, it's not true of the whole of Bristol, right? That sometimes people come to me and say, I was there and I didn't do that. Well, obviously that
Not
yeah, the
100%,
creative
yes.
people who invested in music. So yeah, you would buy a record and you would just exchange them with friends, and sometimes they would go to London to find the best records. So having um, proto DJ, someone with connections in Berlin and New York, like Mark Stewart, or later on Daddy G, in your own record shop in Clifton, which is 20 minutes walk away from your school anyway. That was a game changer, because it became a daily activity instead of let's wait for that moment when we can go to London once or twice a year. And that was very central. And then from there, people would go a few streets down, and there would be that place that called the Dugout, which was a club that again emerged from trying to put on parties in a disused bar,
Yeah.
becoming the place where you could see literally everyone, and the sound had already mixed then. The White Bunch were active first as DJs, so they would play tracks that were hip hop from New York, and then mix it with some post-punk and then other soulful stuff. So while they were mixing, that's how they learned to maybe write songs in their own
Mm.
way, because they were never musicians, or they didn't start learning music in the studio. They really started at home with the first samplers and being obsessed with creating parties. And there was all this really interesting three elements, three pillars, like the music, the records, and then the parties, and then the visual side, right? So
Hmm.
the mostly, and that was very defining for 3D, the third member of my Civic, the album covers. To him, it was like artwork. It was more important than painting.
Right.
It was like you collected them, you knew them by heart, you digged into what it meant, the history, the visuals. And that's how he started, doing flyers for the parties with different references to this record's visual side, and then starting himself drawing, and he became a graffiti artist. So there was always this element of like how you dress, how you present yourself, and how you create that mystique around it. Like he would
Right.
represent young guys with that style, clashing punk and more of black music and reggae through graffiti. Like, it was only 20 years old. It was already a big star in Bristol, because it was very much different before that era, like the early 80s. And that's a completely different thread in the book, right? Because it becomes a story of its own, where actually graffiti also arrived in Bristol way before other places in Europe.
Hmm.
So there were connections with New York, and 3D was really, really a key part of that. So from 93, 94, he was already really known for making big murals, and all of them had reference to music. And his band, the Wild Bunch, I mean, the Wild Bunch was not really a band, even though they produced a couple of EPs. They were a collective, and they were more,
Right.
yeah, like existing as DJ party enablers, and what we would probably call today cultural curators.
Exactly. They're like professional listeners that are just trying to share their
Exactly.
joy, with the people that are there with them.
Exactly. And most of them, I mean, I guess a few of them dreamt of working in music, but most of them at the time, they were not seeing that as a job or something who could make money. It was a way to relate to culture, a culture that is made with you and at the same time as you, while most people live in a culture that's already established and, sold to you towards something that's really recognized already. So it's a form of repetition, and it's a form of um cultural establishment. While and these
Mhm.
guys hated establishment. They were into the new. They wanted to make their own paths into a different culture. So at the time, graffiti was hated in the city by everyone, politicians, parents, everyone. It was really difficult to do that. And probably the same with those fun parties. Not everybody was a fan.
Yeah. No, one of the things I found really interesting and just kind of an aha moment was reading about how even Banksy, was influenced by 3D and his graffiti work, and just like, wow, how profound this guy is. And here I only knew him as like the guy from Massive Attack, and all of a sudden he's inspiring, some of the most popular artists around the world.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting part of the story. I mean, 3D is an interesting guy on many levels, but also he's got this trend where he prefers mystery than anything else. So he absolutely loved his time with graffiti, but he's also getting bored very quickly of any form of art. So he switched
Mm.
very fast. So he did influence Banksy very deeply, and they know each other really well. And I think they never talk about it, but there was probably a moment where, there was a bit of a competition. But he switched form very, very much quicker. So Banksy established a special style of graffitiing through standstill, because he needed to act really fast. He started about 10 years later in the mid to late 90s. So graffiti was still very much illegal. And so he decided he would focus on that, something really
Mm.
strong that you can pre-plan at home and just paint with the stencil and then run away. And
Yeah.
that came from 3D. 3D was a big fan of stencil at a time where graffiti by all the superstars, especially in the US, was considered free hand. If you were using stencil, you were a cheater. right?
Mm,
So that's a thing that traveled through the way he used cutting and pasting to create the first album covers and party flyers and posters and also paintings. Basically, he painted in a lot of the venues that we mentioned. You know, some of the bars, some of the
right.
uh, outdoor spaces as well. He painted in an area that's called St. Paul's that we haven't mentioned yet, but that's one parts of Bristol where most of the Caribbean people lived in the 70s. So that's where they had most of the reggae parties and the carnival every year, which is a big Caribbean carnival. And so that was also another occasion to throw parties and to paint on walls and to have everything at the same time, the togetherness, the liveliness, the creating a show, plus curating sound and curating visuals live.
Abs- yeah. You mentioned St. Paul's there. So the riots, are definitely a pretty pivotal moment in the city's history. How did that moment of like civil unrest and almost kind of even revolution shape like the political awareness of the artists of the scene?
Yeah, that's a very interesting moment, of course. There were a couple of series of riots, a bit more than that, but a couple of moments that were really, really strong, notably in 86 and in 81. And that was a time where basically, as I said, the Caribbean population, Caribbean British population grew, but the police repression in the UK at the time was really high. And they were a very difficult moment in British history, not in Bristol, but in London, in Birmingham, and in other parts of the country where repression was really violent and people died. There was also the New Cross fire, where a lot of people were killed that were supposed to be a
Mm,
racist incident. So a big party, birthday party, I think for a 17-year-old, turned into a horror night, voluntarily started. And then there was a trial, and, no one got to be formally recognized as guilty. So that traumatized this part of the population because let's remind listeners and readers that, these Caribbean people, when they came to the UK, they were under a heavy propaganda that this was their homeland. It was perfect. It was paved with gold, and that was where
right.
they belonged. They would rebuild the country. They were needed. So they were not really prepared for the level of racism and exclusion. So a small community built up in St. Paul's where people organized to resist and to protect each other from attacks and police brutality. And so the riots were a special moment where not only the black people would march and face the police, but also other people joined. So this happened in other parts of the world, but I think for a city as small as Bristol at the time, it was probably 300,000 inhabitants, and for the UK, it was a pretty quiet, you know, West
Right.
England is known for being quite green. It's the countryside, so it's one of the rare big cities there. And so it kind of stayed in people's minds. But I think what's even more interesting is how it was not really commented on and studied historically until very recently. And I also learned that, Bristol had its very Rosa Parks moment with the bus boycott that as
Mm,
as well similarly was very, very rarely mentioned in history books when actually a set of bus drivers of Caribbean origin went on strike because they were not allowed to work for the omnibus company. And so they kind of won. There was this big moment where people decided that no, you are not supposed to do that. This is discriminatory. And the law changed in the UK. The first anti-racist law were actually written down and passed in Parliament, all that in the late 60s. So that was very the foundational, I think, moment that gave the people courage to protest.
mm.
And then it's also interesting when I talk to historians about that, actually the first guy who did his PhD about the riots was there himself at the time. So he was not only, going through archives, he remembered some of it.
Personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and he could reconnect with the people who were directly involved. And he said to me, the fact that it's called riot is a way to politicize it because we would call it uprising or protest, and riot
Mhm.
is a way to say you are wrong, you are violent, and that's reproduced a lot in British history up until 2011 in London and other moments that we would today compare to actually the Black Lives Matter movement. They were protests against police brutality. They turned into riot because people, then came, join, and were angry and destroyed stores. And when you affect capitalism, of course, you make headlines
Yeah,
as a rioter. But they started
exactly.
protest. Exactly.
So, do you think Massive Attack's music and kind of just the messages that they spoke to would have had like the same sound without that Thatcher era Britain as a backdrop?
Actually, I can't even imagine that music without the backdrop. It's so ingrained. I mean, they had little money. Everything they were doing was that part of Bristol was very anti-system, anti-establishment. So they hated the fact that the UK was a kingdom. They hated the Tories, and here they were living with that Margaret Thatcher narrative above their head, while their parents came from the Caribbean or Italy, or they were really resentful, and that was the fuel to their anger. And
Mm,
that's also going back to the punk thing. You have to have a message. They were not rebels without causes, right? They had really a city that was kind of culturally deprived, right? There was
yeah.
no place where you could go and listen to music. There was maybe one music hall and the famous Old Vic, where I'm pretty sure they never went because that was the middle class, old-fashioned place that would perform
Right.
typical never-ending. It's changed now. The Old Vic in Bristol has become a really good place for cultural discussions, and they include the conversation on the post Black Lives Matter protest very deeply because at the time where the US had those protests after the death of George Floyd, that very well, the protests expanded in Bristol, and the protester toppled statue that had been controversial for almost a century, the one of a
Mm.
slave trader. So it was very direct in the city. There was this same sort of rage against um, like a fake version for them, a fake version of the country that was, very elitist, very
Mm.
class based, and they're all sons of workers, proud of it. They didn't go to university, they didn't intend to grow by aspiring to belong to the middle class. They wanted to be anti-system. So the first lyrics they wrote were mentioning Margaret Thatcher, whether tricky or 3D. Actually, 3D painted a very great mural that was very known at the time, and he reproduced it on a canvas, and he ended up in a gallery in London for a bit, where he painted with a stencils portraits of the face of Margaret Thatcher, and um, in the next column, she was transforming into Marilyn Monroe, which was a bit of a statement on like pop culture,
Yeah.
post-war ideal of, commodification of power. And that was quite clever because of the hair and
Yeah.
the fact that these two faces of women. I mean, there's very few women have ever been so powerful or considered so influential. And of course, you would not associate them. So that was a very clever one. So I do think that it was in their DNA, and you can still feel that today in the way they comment very openly on social media on the state of British politics. And you can never really put them on just one side, like, oh, they vote for Labour or they support that policy. It's more
Right.
against what's unfair, against the ones that don't want the people to have a voice. It's just a philosophy more than a political allegiance.
Right. Speaking up, whether it's yeah this party or that party, and just looking out for people.
Exactly. Because sometimes it's quite incoherent. I mean, I remember some days where they were supporting Labour, like their life depended on it for an election, and then the next election they were like, Labour's are crap, let's vote for the Green. So I mean, it's
Right.
a bit teenager like, but it's also visceral.
Absolutely. So instead of, that traditional band focus, they really focus, whether it's the Wild Bunch, whether it's Massive Attack, on kind of the collective ethos of everybody having, say, an influence. How did that like anonymity and that collective identity resonate with the listeners?
It's a difficult question. It was very important for them, that's for sure. I think it's difficult to follow because they had so many members and these kept changing. So I think
Mm,
sometimes it was not always the most commercial decision, but I think it became important at a time where, if we fast forward a little, so Blue Lines came out in 91, and then Protection, Massive Attack's second album, in 94. At the same time, Portishead released their first album, and Tricky went solo with his own. So there we have the Bristol scene. We're in the mid 90s, and the mid 90s are dominated in the UK by pop music and this very Britpop generation that is hyper
mhm.
commercialized, and it's typical reproduction of the Beatles' successful pattern: four boys, middle class, nice hair, and one lead singer that is quite sexy and handsome. This
It's
was not
almost
what
like
the Beatles
you're
were.
describing Oasis or Stone
Yeah,
Roses or any of those guys. Yeah.
yeah, and especially Blur.
Oh,
But
yep.
that was not what the Beatles were. The Beatles were working class, and they all contributed to the song. But of course, the history, the mythification around, the death of John Lennon, or whether you prefer Paul McCartney, that gave in the 90s that sort of band with guys who looks cool but are quite well educated. And so obviously Massive Attack, they were the opposite of that. They were difficult to get. They were many. They were working together. They always had many voices, and they kept inviting other voices into them.
Right.
So that's also a way to catch attention. And again, it's a way to be more faithful to who you are. It's still a statement about, we started in those caves in Bristol. It was all for fun. Everyone was included. And that's the thing, it's not just black music, because today the UK is much more fragmented when it comes to this question.
Mm,
What happened at the time was so multicultural that it's hard to undo. That producer was a white guy, that the best rapper 3D was Anglo-Italian, and then you had people who were more African and Caribbean, and then a Cherry, who was a friend of them, was Swedish American, Sierra Leonese. So
right.
it was welcoming this openness and differences that today is a bit harder to do because of all the politics around identity. It's not so easy. Or if you want to be a black guy and you invite a white guy in your song, it's a statement. You can't just do
Mm,
it and just pretend that it's for fun. But that what they were about. So that was also quite visually arresting, right? You had at the same time huge fame for people like Björk, who was from is still is from Iceland and moved to London. So the more different, the more space you could occupy. So I think it worked for them, and I'm sure the audience liked that because you had some strong, successful patterns from the States with great, other gangs or groups of
mhm.
rappers that would evolve, invite each other. I absolutely adored that. I mean, the surprise when you saw that this guy with a wonderful voice was featured on that track, that's always super exciting, isn't it? But of
Oh,
course,
absolutely.
if you're a purist and you always want Tom York to be on every song of Radiohead's perfect records, maybe you're not going to be a fan of this sort of explosive mix of craziness. But I'm pretty sure it did talk to a lot of music lovers.
Well, I think it sent, a good message kind of in that punk mentality of like this can be for everybody. It's hard
Yeah,
not to support that where you have people of different races, different abilities, different, music backgrounds all coming
and
together to make
different
something
genders.
pretty cool. Right.
They had a lot of female artists, vocalists, and musicians with them, which was not typical of that era. So yeah, exactly.
So, uh, Blue Lines comes out. It didn't just succeed. It kind of reset like what British music could be. What conditions do you think like had to be in place for that record to land how it did in the UK?
Well, what is funny also is how it was made and how the the guys and their friends experienced this success because they didn't expect it at all. They were still very much living the production of this record as the culmination of their experience within the Wild Bunch. So it was more like documenting what they were capable of.
Mm,
The music at the time was perpetually evolving. The tracks were remixed and changed, and the chorus would be moved and removed, and then something would come at this place. So they were not used to fixing a song or to write a song as if it was always planned this way. So it's not easy, especially when you're 12, to go into the
Right.
studio and decide this is going to be what the album is, with that track and then this following. So that was a bit of a chaotic process. And that's where the producer, who was the husband of Nana Cherry, helped a bit. As in, guys, this is gold. If you don't decide that it's going to be 7 minutes and not 9, it's no one will ever hear it. So that happened at a time where they were kind of forced to stop a minute and look at what they had accomplished over that previous decade and how much of a movement they were showing up with Blue Lines. It was not just a record, right? It was a new way of making music. It was a
Hmm.
sound that nobody has ever heard in Britain. They were very powerful black music like Sade, who was Nigerian British, but she was much more of a legacy that you could recognize, this type of voice and very powerful voice on top of things and songwriting. But what they were proposing was very unknown and very seductive because on top of being very multicultural, it was also very positive. It was like, you're gonna hate us, we're cool, we're happy, we're not making any trouble. And it's probably their happiest album as well, right? I mean, if you've listened to the others, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, exactly. It gets darker from there.
Exactly. So it was a bit of a mini phenomenon. But when I asked 3D about exactly that question, like, because there was a point when the more I was reading about the part before Massive Attack, the more I was like, how did they do that? You know, how did they become such an important band by having no money, no degree, no connection, right?
Right.
And he himself didn't seem to have the answers. Like, it was really a moment for us. We had tried touring something bigger than the parties, and they went to Japan, for instance, and that was fun, but that didn't really, succeed. And suddenly they had this thing, and everybody was commenting with this extraordinary reviews, you know, the best album in British history, blah, blah, blah. So they were taken aback. And that's what is really endearing. They were so living in the moment. They were so doing what they loved and what is
Right.
purely them that they didn't really overthink the reception. And then it changed everything. It was actually complicated for them because they had to go on TV on top of the pops, for instance, which
Right.
was very typical mainstream television thing where you had to wear certain clothes and have people dancing and be able to be confident. And they were not that. They were like used to be trying on noises in the dark for 10 years. Some of them were hardly out of their late teens. So he was really in your face, but they were cut out for it, obviously, right? They
They
were smart.
exactly. The success speaks for itself on that one.
Yeah, totally. When you look at the archive, it's actually quite wonderful. You have like people on the TV set dancing in the background like they would do for a pop star. And then
Right.
you have these guys that are so not what you would see on TV, and that's wonderful, right? It's the best television. It's so raw, and it's this guy rapping, and it's really cool. It was really a moment, and it's a lot of coincidences that worked. The technological shifts,
Hmm.
the fact that you could play. They played a lot with synthesizers, so a lot of the music could be pre-played and then improvised a bit. So it was kind of their way of playing live would be to remix a bit the
Hmm.
songs with lots of pre-prepared tracks, which is very, very cool now. It's electronic music 100%. It's completely banal, but at the time it was still very, very new. People wanted you to be a good piano player or guitar player, but
Right.
didn't expect that sort of let's try these noises or let's try slowing down the tracks so much that you're going to be disoriented. And that's part of the definition of their music. A lot of people in Bristol call it the Bristol sound or down tempo. They hate the word trip hop, obviously, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But the music is
I
called
know.
tempo because it was a time where people were into the pre-jungle time, high, super speedy pop music, and even rock and roll was very, very powerful, very much upbeat. Even Nirvana was playing really fast, right? So that
Hmm.
down tempo was also counterintuitive and countercultural. And that's a funny statement when you think of it, to try to be radical by bringing slow tracks of 10 minutes.
Exactly.
It's so easy.
You're going against the establishment instead of having a 2 minute 30 second rocker. You're
Yeah,
dragging it out and fitting some fun sounds in there. So I
the way
guess
you
that
did it,
makes it,
right?
yeah, that makes me wonder, like, so British audiences, what made them connect so well with the music? It certainly wasn't like the typical radio stuff they were hearing. Was it just kind of that anti-cultural sense? Was it something more than that?
I think it was because it was lacking, right? There was so much in British music, and I grew up in France, as you said at the beginning. So for me, British music has always been like, wow, some sort of much bigger level. But that part that was so contemporary was a bit lacking, right? And at the same time, you had a band like Soul to Soul who reached really great success in London, and they were friends. The producer used to be in the White Bunch, Nelly Hopper, but Soul to Soul is much more of a soul band, right? Massive
Mhm.
Attack was already doing, for me, it's electronic music that had a super strong reggae base. That's how I would define Blue Lines, right?
Mhm.
So it was a bit ahead of its time, and it was totally, totally on the side of cool. I mean, I think for 10 years, Massive Attack was the coolest thing in England. They were always ahead. The way they spoke, the way they were really radical and disturbing. Like, I mean, once they appeared on TV to get an award, and they were not even that famous at the time, and they insulted, the hostess. She was part of the royal family, and they're so anti-royal. And now, she's known to be the ex-wife of Prince Andrew. So now we understand the level of hatred. But it was even the parents of 3D were shocked that he refused to talk to her. But when you look back, it was so perfect. They were young, they were hip, they didn't have
Yeah,
to go to some form of royalty that was completely, you know, past and shouldn't even be there. So they were very raw, right? They were like, okay, we're going to be who we are, and that's it. And that was just expected of that time. There was no one like that. So of course it clicked with a lot of young people. It was just the coolest band. It was very much linked to nightlife, to fun, to refusing to be, working 9 to 5, which was the
mhm.
very big model in London, like big capitalistic city, money, money, money. And here they had like post-Marxist lyrics. That would probably be a bit hard to do that today. I don't know. Maybe we need it. What do you think? I think we
Yeah, yeah. I would not be opposed to another movement like that coming around here.
why not? Let's hope so.
Exactly. So, as they kind of work into Mezzanine, what was it that changed in the group's writing and studio processes that kind of brought in that darker sound? I mean, like you said on the first album, it was much more, reggae and probably their poppiest, and from there it just kind of gets darker and darker.
Yes, very much so. And I think for many people, Mezzanine is paradoxically the favorite album, right? The best, the iconic Massive Attack album.
It's
What
mine for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I completely understand. I mean, for me, it's in my probably my top five of best album ever. And I'm not saying that as in I know what's good music, but it's my favorite. It's on my favorites. But lots of things happen. So first, the recording of Blue Lines was chaotic, and when they recorded their second album, they discovered that the recording was not chaotic because it was their first time, but because that was their modus operandi. So
Yep.
so Protection was a disaster personally. Daddy G was almost never there. 3D was partying hard. It was Nelly Hopper, who was very successful at the time, was producing Bjork, he was producing Soul to Soul. He had tons of connection, but that meant that he had this great immersion in a wonderful world of creativity, but he didn't even have time to process it and to come back to the studio in a normal state to work properly.
Right.
And the third member was really upset because he's the one that's discreet, you know, introvert and really communicating through music only. So he was not too happy to have a very absentee bandmate and a very excited, over inspired third bandmate. But when it came to Mezzanine, there was quite well ahead. Like we're talking almost 10 times apart from the first tracks of Blue Lines. So they had toured a lot more, which was difficult for them because the big festivals are very rock based. meaning the guitars, the drums, and bringing a stable set list. And again, that's not the way they like to process live.
Right.
So they had to change a bit the way they perform live just to connect with the audience, because the audiences were really not used to, especially abroad, to this process. So they found their pace in a way where they were still DJ centric, with lots of the bass being the rhythm, anything that could express the rhythm. So not only the drums, but pre-mixed samples and stuff.
Hmm.
And then sometimes they would extend on that, tracks that would last 10 minutes, which is some of the things they do best. But because it's very slow sound, they were put on the very, very late slot of festivals, for instance, because it's dark, it's slow, it's long, so it's the perfect interloping time before the DJ and after the last act. But for Mezzanine, obviously, 3D was inspired by this experience of like, how do you connect emotionally with an audience? And I think what changed radically is the way he worked with some of the the instrumentalist on stage. And he was particularly close with their guitarist at the time. So again, the core member of the band are the three DJ slash rapper, and the rest is always flexible. So they didn't have a fixed guitarist, but since the mid 90s and up to Mezzanine, they had a very, very strong, coherent way of working with Angelo Bruschini. And Angelo, I think he came from the punk scene, and he understood right away how Massive Attack could benefit from a different way of using the guitar. So basically, you had to use the guitar like a bass guitar, or even like, rhythm, a pure rhythmic element, or maybe disturbing sort of instrument. You see, you never have like this riff or this guitar moment in a Massive Attack song.
Right. There's no solo to bust out in the,
No,
during the
definitely.
10-minute jam. Yeah.
No, even though that's music that they love, but that's not what they were trying to create. So that has a profound effect, I think, on 3D. And that's also because he's the one who was really friends with other bands. As I said, Mushroom was really isolated at home, happy, living his best life with Tricky in studios in Bristol. And Daddy was, and it always has been and still is, a DJ. So, he can play tracks, he can love tracks, but he is not fixed on what he's trying to create. So 3D was really a fan and a friend at this stage of bands like Radiohead and of course Damon Albarn. They really clicked very early on. And I think he was really appreciating the thing that maybe how they were changing by playing live was important. Even though that's not their strong point, it was like, we can create songs while we're touring, and we can get inspired by having the instrumentalists with us. So that's how a song like Rising Sun came about. It was this sort of like the guitar part was, and they tried it on stage many times before they even went in the studio to create a third album. So that was one of the main, I think, shift. But then, of course, what people know probably more is that I think Mezzanine was 3D's time. As we said, every track had produced with a guest, and everyone would put a bit more of who they are, but then they would rotate all these roles. But when they were doing Mezzanine, 3D was like super involved and a bit more awake. And he had so many ideas. And I think there was a time for him where all his obsession for punk and post-punk when he was a teenager were coming back with a vengeance. And he was so inspired by some of the songs that he loved that just worked with this experience that he had connecting with the guitarist on stage. I think it's just the same language in a way. But the way he used the samples it is really interesting, right? Because you won't recognize the whole song from The Cure. It's just a tiny noise that's almost like hidden homage to some songs
Right.
that he loved, that then he used as a form of a rhythmic invention. And I think the best way to try to dig into that is to rewatch some of the recordings, even though they're obviously not professional because they never let anyone film their show apart from Glastonbury festivals. There are recordings of their tour from 2019 called Mezzanine 21 that's prepared for the 21st anniversary of the record, because they don't do things like typical. They don't do the 20th.
Yeah.
So they performed entirely. They covered the song that they sampled. So then you have
Oh,
laid
wow.
some of the undoing of the album, and that was quite impressive. Nobody expected them to do that, but that was quite brilliant, and that worked really, really well, especially with the fans that love that side of their music.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it's like a little treasure hunt within the music, and then you get the whole
Exactly.
thing played out like that. That's a nice little homage to the fans and just yeah, the history of the band.
Yeah, and then of course that recording was really difficult. It's very well documented, right? So that was not, I didn't tell people in my book, what they had to fight during mezzanine. I think everyone's aware of that. And when you
Yeah.
can hear it on the record. It's very, very dark, especially lyrically. Sometimes it's almost puzzling. I was watching again, because I've seen it a million times, the video of the song Initial Crips, and it's so
Hmm.
dark, so disturbing. And it's the same with Angel. Angel is probably the biggest success, and the video is extraordinary because Angel is the lyrics come from a love song that actually belonged to Horace Andy himself. Um, and it's Angel, a lovely, lovely term.
Yeah.
But the song is very fractious, and the video is actually showing how most of the band turns against one of them who has to run away, and it's very, very dark.
Hmm.
And that's very symbolic of how the recording happened for me. And that's the video of Initial Crips for me represents that exactly. They're all fighting for each song as if they were their most precious person, right? So there were moments where one of them would record something, and then the sound engineer would be the only guy who would be there throughout the process. And then the next morning, the other guy would work on it, and then on and on and on. And then when the first guy would come back, he would be so upset of the
Hmm.
changes, that. But you wouldn't think this would work, but it did work, because in the end, I guess the sound engineer has to be credited here, Neil Davidge, because he was patient enough and talented enough to see how such a crazy process could actually be very creative, and to focus on the best results by guiding the guys, like said, listen, you've created something really great here, you could undo stuff, but do keep that part. But for them, it was the end of it, right? Because Mushroom left the band in
Right.
1999, and that would never going to be reproduced, because first, no human can probably survive that level of tension and hatred. I mean, I know many bands are known to hate each other, but on top of that, there were, night living and drugs and alcohol, so it
Yeah.
wasn't pretty. I think they fell out really big time. So yeah, a bit like, I remember Mushroom mentioning bands like, you know, obviously splitting through an album, and then some of them managed to recreate music separately, but it would never be the same. So yeah.
We had covered the Outcast album Speaker Box Love Below a couple episodes back, and it was that same story of everybody's kind of working on their own thing. One guy clocks into the studio. When he's done, the other guy switches, and the engineer's got to be ready with the tape and get the ideas down, and maybe they'll go over each other's work, but they're not going to interact with each other.
Yeah, and I think actually once I discussed this for months and months, I was almost wondering, how do musicians do music and get along? It's actually
Right.
the other way around that's difficult, because the Beatles also were fighting a lot, especially towards the end. It was impossible because they were all full of great ideas, and you have to compromise, which is not always natural to everybody. And that also inspired 3D a lot, songs that melted. The Beatles had wonderful songs that were actually two songs merged into one. And he really loved that. He grew up with the Beatles a lot. His mother was
Mhm.
listening to that, so that influenced him a lot. He didn't mention it in many interviews, but that's obvious, and he said it to me many times. I think it was just not cool enough when they were starting with Blue Line, saying, "I
Right.
listen to the Beatles," but it's true. He just, yeah, he liked them. And then later on, they got to record in Abbey Road, and that was really important to them.
Yeah.
So
That I mean
yeah, that
that's a
was very
huge win right there.
fun.
So I guess what I read was the working title for the album was "Damaged Goods" before it became Mezzanine, and I think that speaks a little bit maybe like what's going on in the people's lives. And one of the more interesting stories that came out of that I think was Liz Fraser, who sang on Teardrop. She had written the song about Jeff Buckley, and as she went to record, she found out that he had passed away. So it almost became this therapy session, as she's singing it, as she's recording it. Do you think that like this album has moments like that where they're using it as a space to work through the problems of life, or even just kind of a therapeutic outlet?
I think this is particularly true for Teardrop. And Teardrop is an interesting song. It's gorgeous. I love it personally. And I think it's also very much one of their legacy song because it lived
Mhm.
again and it traveled through television and films, and it's very well known now. But Liz Fraser collaboration on Mezzanine was obviously a game changer. I haven't mentioned her before, but she's very talented. They all respected her. They also chose her because the music she did with her previous bands was very post-punk,
Mm.
and that was a statement, even though what she sings on Mezzanine has nothing to do with that trend. And it's true that she had a brief, very strong friendship with Jeff Buckley, but when she recorded Mezzanine, she was actually dating Massive Attack's drummer, Damon Reese. So it was a time of her life where she was finally stable. She moved to Bristol. She still lives there. They all live there. So she's Scottish originally, and she went through a traumatic relationship with her partner in the Cocteau Twins. And so that moment in her life was very healing personally. Even though, Liz, if you hear me, I'm sorry, she hates to talk about her personal life. But yeah, when she heard about the passing of Jeff, um, of course it was a heartbreak because they had this sort of soul bond, like they didn't know each other forever, but they have a very interesting story where she was a big fan of his father's music and he was obsessed with her and the Cocteau Twins. So when he met her, he was the one who was in awe of her while, he was a global superstar and the most talented musician in the
Right.
US world at the time. So that must be weird. I mean, I was a huge fan of Jeff Buckley. I think Grace is probably the best album that ever came out of that sort of music in the USA. So when you hear that he was so humbled and impressed by Liz Fraser, that's a fantastic story, right? So they exchanged letters and they produced music together, and that was a very important time in her life. But when she was working with Massive Attack, she was already, in another relationship, and she got pregnant very soon because actually when they made the video that is representing a fetus moving to the song, she was
Mm.
pregnant herself. So you see, it's a lot of heavy emotions, and she is the presence I think that makes Mezzanine so bearable because otherwise the
Yeah.
rest as much it's extraordinarily powerful, but it's also heavy and intense. And you can see also when you see that album played live that she was a force of that's the moment where the crowd is finally completely in tune and completely happy after all the fracture, and that's a very interesting element. That's not the only song in which she sings, and there's the last song and a few others. So for that, yes, and I guess for the sound engineer, there were moments that were very healing because you go through turmoil and then finally you create something beautiful. There was also a moment in her life where they went to record separately. So Neil took 3D to Cornwall and then some of the other guys later. And
Mhm.
one day they were there in Cornwall and they were walking along the beach and they almost got caught in a cave by the waters, by the tides.
Ah,
So after that, they had this sort of philosophical moment where, you kind of want to survive. So there were lots of episodes like that. But for me, overall, it was a very fractious experience, and the band split, and things were never the
yeah.
same. And it took them a long time before they could produce music again.
So, talking about Teardrop, I'm kind of curious if you had heard this. What we had read was that Madonna was originally approached to be the singer on that, uh, but actually 3D and Daddy G were the ones to say no thanks to Madonna. Had you heard that before?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, we talked about it a lot. It's
Yeah.
quite weird. So Massive Attack worked with Madonna a few years prior when she was approached to do an album of covers song of Marvin Gaye,
Mhm.
and Massive Attack were the one to work with her on a cover of I Want You, which is absolutely gorgeous. And so they had met briefly, and they said they were really impressed by her because she was such a big star, and they were not, right? As successful as they were in the UK, they were never at that level.
Right.
So it's not like they've never heard of her, and that sounds a bit crazy, but I think Teardrop would never have been sung by Madonna. But because of the process of dispute, the proto version of the melody that became Teardrop, way before Liz was involved, that at some point Mushroom wanted to use to write a song with Madonna.
Mm.
And then 3D and Daddy G had agreed, and it came to their sound engineer and said, we want this some of the songs to be worked with Liz Fraser, and they wanted to use the same beginning of a song with her. And that, when they worked with Liz, became Teardrop. But if they had worked with Madonna, it would have been a different song. See what I mean?
Right. Well, I mean, thank goodness they put their foot down on that one because I
Yeah,
mean, wound up with a
definitely.
gem, yeah, and kind of the only ray of sunshine on the album.
Yeah, and then for me, I think the only reason why Mushroom wanted to work with Madonna was just to piss the other one off because
Yeah.
that sound, guys, you've done that. It was already weird, but it's two different worlds here. She's got a nice,
Totally.
it's different vibes. So a lot of the song that Teardrop is today is due to Liz. I mean, she wrote the lyrics, she added a lot of the energy and the vocal melody. So that wouldn't Madonna would never have written that. Let's be clear.
Right.
When I read that, I'm like, yes, Madonna at some points was contacted, and apparently she called back to the studio, and
Right.
one of them picked up, and she was like, "Hey guys, I'd be happy to work with you. I liked the demo," but they politely declined, and that wasn't the finished song that we know. She did not have anything to do with it. She didn't add anything to it. It was just a weird moment where three guys from Bristol who've only done 3 albums in 7 years had to turn down Madonna.
Right. Somewhere there's a parallel universe with that song finished, and yeah,
Yeah,
maybe we'll get to hear it
probably.
someday. So I guess now, as we kind of wind down, time to get a little personal. I'm curious, what was your first exposure and impression to Massive Attack? Was this something you loved right away? Was this something that grew on you? Where did it start for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the first time I heard them was with Unfinished Sympathy, which is a song that
Mm.
I absolutely adore. But at the time, I was very, very young. I think I was barely 12. And the song was featured in a film. And I think it was a little bit too much for me. It was so emotional. And the film was really, very erotic. And, it was Sharon Stone. I think it was called Sliver.
Mm.
And that was very overwhelming. And I didn't associate it right away with Blue Lines because I was very young. I was still listening to the Jackson 5. They were not
There you go.
contemporaries
Yeah.
of mine, but I was still listening to, Thriller and stuff like that. And then a few songs were more known, but I think for me, Protection, their second album, was a big thing because that was a time where I was a teenager. I was a bit older than 12. And we experienced music with the videos on
Hmm.
MTV or something like that, on MTV Europe. So there's a delay, right? Songs would get picked up by MTV, by the US, and then come back to the rest of Europe. And these videos like Karma Coma and Protection, they came along with, the best of Radiohead or some of British music. And as I said, I've always loved British music, but that album, Protection, for me it was a bit of a revelation because it was the first time that I listened to the whole thing from Massive Attack, and I thought, this is the perfect genre because there's
Right.
everything taken from everywhere. You don't need anything else, right?
It's a four-course meal on one plate. Exactly.
Exactly. There were very trippy songs, a very beautiful vocal from the singers. So one was a Nigerian singer, the other one was Tracy Torn, whose big hit before that toured the world as well, Missing. and the remix of that. So it sounded so timely and ahead of its time at the same time, and the videos were very crazy and powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, Jonathan Glazer, I think, did the video for Karma Coma, and now he's got this interesting career, hasn't he? So that really stayed with me. But because I was a teenager and Massive Attack were extremely slowly, by the time they came up with another album, I was already, I had almost left my parents. So you're
Right.
a highly different person, from 14 to 18. And that's what I think was really specific with Massive Attack. It's like their albums are so apart and so different, but at the same time, they're so typically Massive Attack. So it had a really strong impact on me. And up until the last album, when I first heard a song from that, I thought they had given up on music, and I was like, wow, this is so different, but this is so them. And
Yeah.
that's something that I love in artists. That's the best definition of a brilliant artist. Like, you can do something entirely revolutionary, but we'll still recognize you. David Bowie, or you know,
Exactly. Good.
it's very cool.
Evolve and metamorphosis.
Yes. So that was the story, I guess. I think Protection entered my space, my head space, and then Mezzanine was really like an encore. But I knew Unfinished, and I think it's one of the best songs we've ever produced in the United Kingdom.
So, if you're stranded on a desert island and you only have one record, are you going with Protection or are you going with Mezzanine? Which one are you taking?
Well, that's a very difficult question for me, because first I can't even go on a desert island with only Massive Attack. But yeah, because I think my favorite singer is PJ Harvey, and then there's all this
Oh, okay.
soul library that you have in the United States. But Nina Simone, greatest artist ever. But it's hard because, you know what? I think some of the best music by Massive Attack is not on their albums. It is some of the songs that they've written in between, and those songs that have ended up on, B-sides or collaborations with other artists, or they agreed at some point to do some sort of anthology. I mean, they hate the word compilation, but that's how it's
Yeah.
called in Europe. It's called Collected, and it's a bunch of their hits with an extra CD with at least 10 other songs, and those are some of their best work, like Live With Me, and I don't know if you know these songs, False
No, writing
Flags.
them down though. Yeah.
Yeah, so that era, 2004, 2005, I absolutely adore their Force album, unlike pretty much every critic or reviewer of Massive Attack. I have decided that, reviewers hate bands who do three great albums straight up. So they just kill the Force album out of principle.
We had a bit of discussion last week about Pearl Jam with that same thing where, it was B-sides are some of the best songs. And then you have the first three albums from them, love it, critics loved it, and then all of a sudden, where's the love? We're growing up with these bands, so we love albums 4, 5, and 6, but where's the critics on it? All of a sudden, like you said, after 3, nah, we're done with you guys.
Yeah, I find that extremely cruel, because I'm not a musician. I'm obsessed with music, and I wish I could play an instrument, but I think it's already very, very difficult to renew yourself, and there are artists that I love that have periods where they're a bit lost. And so I find that I was asked to teach music journalism for a bit in Bristol after my book came out, and that's one of the things that I tried to discuss with students. I'm like, reviewers are sometimes so harsh, and they can't produce
Yeah.
anything for the life of them.
Uh-huh.
Break. They don't know
Those who
what.
can't do critique, right?
Yeah. It's
So I
too
guess, yeah,
cruel.
it is. I mean, I guess it's a way to move the records and to tell you what to listen to, but at the same time, yeah, it's art and it should all be kind of given that love.
Yeah, so for listeners, I absolutely adore their fourth album, Hundredth Window. I live with it. It was a huge statement for me. It came out after the war in Iraq, and that totally inspired them. And it was totally about the switch between the centuries, and the fast move forward, the internet, and all the science fiction that we have now, like AI. And it
Right.
was much more gentle than Mezzanine, and very, very different. And they worked with Sinead O'Connor, which is an idol of mine.
Yes.
I think it's just a rarity. It was perfect for that time. Critics have been very unfair with it. And finally, I know my answer is just completely cheating. They they created an album that never came out, and those songs are great. That was in 2008. So, some songs became different songs on their last album, Heligoland. But if you can catch up some of this era live on YouTube, they're brilliant songs. Some of them, I think, probably they never admitted it, but I think a couple of them were leftovers from Mezzanine because they could totally have landed there, but then
Mm.
sounding very much more 2008. So yeah, I don't know. I'll die on a desert island with one record like everybody
Well,
else.
we'll send you with an MP3 player full then if we have to. You know, give you some more options because I mean, yeah, it sounds like how do you leave some of that stuff behind? There's too much variety within the group.
Exactly.
So I guess last question. You wrote the book, and it's been what 6 years, 7 years since it came out.
Yeah, so the book came out in England in March 2019. Yeah, just a year before the pandemic. So
Okay.
that will be, yeah, about 6 years. Oh my God, it's terrifying.
Yeah. All right. Are there any questions or stories that you would ask the guys in the group about today if you had a chance to speak with them?
Well, the thing is, like, there's this huge asymmetry in the band. So I think I met with Mushroom once, totally out of the blue in a club in Bristol. And I know he'll never talk about Massive Attack ever to nobody, not
Yeah.
even his mother. But this is the mystery, right? This
It
guy
is.
never spoke in any interview. He was a genius. He never did anything. He's still working on music. I mean, who wouldn't want to ask him questions?
Right. I mean, just to be a fly on the wall for 8 hours and yeah, just see him at work would be, a treat.
Yeah, and a lot of people said he was quite special, like, very different from the rest of the music scene. But when I met him, he was extremely nice in a way that you
Oh,
don't
good.
expect from
Yeah.
a quasi-millionaire. It seems very interesting and sweet, but I don't think it will ever happen. So
Yeah.
there are millions of questions that I have. For me, the most interesting part is that, again, they're obsessed with mystery and I think they don't want to talk about, especially, I guess, the meaning of the lyrics.
Mm.
And I studied literature first, so for years before I did politics. So for me, words that are written is important. And some songs, of course, you don't care because it's obvious that it's meaningless. But
Yeah.
yeah, I would love to expand on some of the lyrics because they are multi-layered for sure. And this is intriguing. So yeah,
It
that
can
would be.
definitely be, yeah, it can be fun to hear, the artists after the fact, tell us if we got it right on the interpretation or, if we're
Yeah.
even in the ballpark. But yeah,
Then
great
again, what
lyrics
I
too, actually.
realized that for many, many bands, most of their love songs were actually about drugs.
Right.
And it was like, okay, maybe that doesn't need a very long discussion. They wrote it as a love song so it could sell, but they were just high and loving it.
Right.
Nothing more
We
to it.
were listening to the Exterminator album by Primal Scream recently, and
Mhm.
there was the whole thing on there. Oh, it's a very politically charged thing, but no, at the end of the day, Kevin Gillespie says no, it's about drugs. I don't know where you got the politics from.
Exactly. That happens a lot with Damon Albarn as well. It's like, no, it was not my girlfriend. It was just heroin. Sorry.
Right. Right. Something else I loved. So, yeah, any final thoughts before we head out? Any takeaways for the listeners? We'd love to know where you can find maybe more of your work, more of your writing.
So the thing with me is that I was international news journalist, especially focusing on the Americas and then Africa. I lived in England, so you see how Bristol came in the middle of all that. But what I'm writing now, I have a job where I cover African affairs, and I took it precisely because the world has changed and
Hmm.
it's so undercovered, right? There are wars everywhere and
Yeah.
the politics in rich countries that we won't comment on in this podcast. So I decided, well, where can I make a difference? I'm going to talk about African politics, culture, music. So I have a blog. It's called Melissa on the Road because I had so many blogs with the name of the city I was in. And then after the 12th
Hmm.
city, I just decided to stick with Melissa on the Road. And I've got a Substack as well, but it's mostly on African affairs and also how Africa has links with everything else in the world. including music, but also history and how politics in our Western world impact them. So if people are interested in that, they can find my Substack, which is also Melissa on the Road, or just my name, Melissa Shamam. But if you're more interested into the Bristol angle, I still have, I don't use it very much, a Facebook page because Facebook has changed so deeply. But it's there, and you can find lots of references to the book and songs that I've shared and stuff like that.
Fantastic. So yeah, again for the listeners out there, check the episode description. We'll have a link to her Substack and to her blog on there, and the book. Highly recommend it. Loving reading it. Massive Attack, Out of the Comfort Zone. Melissa, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It was great having conversation with Seattle so far away. We wish you all the best there. You'll need it.
Oh, absolutely. I guess Paris and Seattle will just meet in the middle and meet in Bristol.
Yeah, you should come over. If you do, let me know.
There you go.
I'll be
All
there.
right. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thank you.